Good evening to everyone. I hope everyone is either full or you do have your dinner with you. This is Romney on the menu, and my name is Nancy Judd, and this is my older brother, John Charles Fisher. I live out in Kirby, and John Charles lives in Berkeley Springs, but we grew up on 28, about 2 miles north, in a house that my mother's father helped her build, and the river was a part of our life, and our father would come to town to work either at J.Brady Thompson's store or his own hardware store that he developed after we got to be a little bit older. So we're going to talk tonight about J.Brady and the tourist homes in Romney. And our aunt, on our father's side, our great aunt, Ruth Thompson, who was married to J.Brady, they had one of the tourist homes here in Romney. So when we went to visit Aunt Ruth, that's where we went, was to her tourist home. And we also have some cousins here tonight that also used, on my dad's side of the family, that used to visit as well, David and Patty Fantassi. So just chime in anytime.
Welcome.
So I'm gonna, I will do this first. This is a picture. These are pictures of, this is down at the end of the Main Street, right, sort of catty-cornered from the grade school. And Dennis Shoemaker and his wife live there now. But now I have my doubts. It says this picture was taken in 1956, which it said on the back of the photograph. However, JC is sitting here in this chair. You take a look at that. And I believe I'm standing right there. And there's the guest in the chair. And I look to be about, what, do I look 4?
Well, probably.
You would be 9?
No, more like 7 or 8, maybe
Right,
6, 7.
right. So maybe this is not exactly 1956, but it's in the 50s. And then it does not have
Can you
a sign.
turn it toward the camera and I'll get a good close-up of it.
This is the picture of the tourist home. And it was called Pilgrims Rest. And I'm not sure why. Do you know?
I'm sure Aunt Ruth just
Okay, decided.
that was appropriate.
Okay.
And that was the rule.
That was the rule. And that, there was a sign, it was very tall and had a light on it and had Pilgrims Rest, and I forget, rooms maybe, or
Steam heat.
steam heat. There you go. That was the big thing, I guess. And it did have steam heat. And it was a warm, moist heat, I remember that. And there were 2 large blue spruces on either side of the home there. And this shows it when it was pretty much in its heyday. And then this is a picture of, well, this was taken at my wedding when we had the reception down at the house on the river. And this is Mrs. Thompson at an older age. And she was able to come to our wedding, and she enjoyed that. And then, for those of you who are interested, this is Randolph and Trudy Yours. And Loudon Thompson is here, and I think this is Gary Long on the steps. We were wanting for space. People were everywhere, but anyway, those are the 2 pictures I brought in of that place. Dot Calvert brought in, there's a house that is right across the street on Charlevoix. It's a big white house on Charlottesville Street that I don't remember it as a tourist home. I remember it when it was a nursing home. Wasn't it a nursing home?
I remember it's a tourist home.
It was a tourist home, you said?
I remember it.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
And do you remember
I
that one?
remember that one.
Well, anyway, Dot and Bill bought the sign from it, and it was called the Corner Tourist Rooms.
Which corner was that on?
Mrs. Gross, Charleville and Route 50.
Oh, right there.
Right on that corner.
South,
There's
north, south.
west.
Where the storage buildings are now?
Where the storage buildings are, right across the street, is a tall white house. And that was the tourist home,
It's a
which,
vacant lot on the
It's a
corner.
vacant lot.
Turn into School Street.
oh, it is?
That's the next house.
That's
Oh,
right.
it is?
You're right.
I'm still living in the
White
past.
house, two-story White
Is
House.
that-
Yeah, I think one of its carnations was a health food store. Is that right? In the bottom, that was just recently?
It was an apartment house at one time too.
Apartment house.
It was
okay.
for sale, it's still available?
I'm still not-
As an empty lot, big lot.
I'm still confused. North side, south side,
It's on the,
North
it's
side,
north side?
the
Okay.
north?
second house, not on the corner, second house down.
From Charlevoix.
Yeah. There's
The second house
well,
down.
there's a brick house there on the corner.
I thought that was the White House. Well, you're probably right.
And then
I'm,
there's the White House. Used to have a little fence in front of it. Then there's a vacant lot, and then there's School Street.
Where the storage buildings are now.
Okay.
It's not near the.
I'm
It's
confused.
not there back to church.
Huh?
Is the house there now?
Yes.
It is. He knows where it is. I didn't recognize this. Dot just, she had found it and remembered it.
I don't know who's built
Was?
that. Do what?
Is it cross Route 50?
Where the hearing aid place is now?
No.
No, that's too far. I think that's too far west, isn't it?
Actually, the last house on the right as you're leaving Romney, there's nothing else.
Oh, really? We're not sure where this house was. I think we need Dot here, but she had to go to a dinner, and it's west of here.
I've got a map right over here.
That's right.
Maybe she'll find it. All right, and then there were, are you gonna talk about the other houses? I mean, Mary's and Mary Lou's.
Okay, sure.
Okay, all right, there were a couple other houses also that were tourist homes in Romney, and I'm gonna let J.C. talk about them, and then he'll go from there to J.Brady's store. Does that sound good? All right, so this is my older brother, J.C.
A lot of you know me, but when I'm inside the town limits of Romney, my name is John Charles. That's what I grew up with for 18 years, and then I left here, and everybody said that's just ridiculous to have two names, so they shortened it to JC. So that was when my first trip to Berkeley Springs, I became JC, and I've stayed there since then.
Goldsboro Avenue.
Goldsboro.
Isn't it?
Anyway, the tourist home business was pretty important. This would have been back in the probably very late 20s and the 30s. It boomed, at least in the Romney area, probably in the mid 40s or early 40s through World War II. The New Century Hotel was here on this site, of course. It was very famous, but all the Greyhound buses to get west came through Romney. So there were several buses east and west, and possibly even one maybe going to Cumberland to tie in that way. But my mother worked at the New Century Hotel before she got married during the war, and helped sell tickets and so forth for the bus. The food apparently was very, very good at the New Century, drew big crowds, and lots of people would stop here. I think Emmett and Nita Oldfield got here because of passing through and stopping, and a lot of other people from the community, but they couldn't handle all the guests that would come in. So tourist homes were a big thing back then, and Aunt Ruth's house was the very first house you saw when you came east at the top of the hill across from the school, and between David and his family and my family and all the other nieces and nephews of J.Brady and Aunt Ruth, if we didn't keep it full, the tourists did. And if she had too many people, she would call one of the other tourist homes. The number one she called was Mary Blue, who was the first house as you come past the deaf and blind school, the first house there. But Mary Blue had a tourist home. And then
It was
even
called the Boxwood.
was that, didn't remember the name, but I can remember it was mandatory every Sunday night we went to Aunt Ruth's to visit. That was non-negotiable. And so we would go there, and people would come in for a room when she was full. She would be on the phone calling Mary. If that didn't work, my grandmother occasionally she took boarders more than tourists, but occasionally she would. She's across from the Presbyterian Church. Her sister, Susan Ewers, is diagonally across from the Presbyterian Church in front of the First National Bank. That was Susan Ewers. She would take in tourists, and I'm sure there were others in the area. Jane Wright, you may know even more than that. Jane's 1 or 2 years older than I am, so that's why. But anyway, that was the tourist home. As I recall, the people would come into the living room at Aunt Ruth. She would collect. She was very demanding about her guests. If you asked for ice, you were asked to leave, because the only people asked for ice were people that wanted to have a cocktail. And Aunt Ruth was a staunch, hardcore supporter of the Temperance League. So alcohol was absolutely forbidden, and if you wanted ice, you just move on someplace else. Also, she informed everybody that the door would be locked at 8 o'clock, and if they weren't in, you could get your luggage the next day. And she was a tough lady like that. She put up with nothing. When we were children, and on those Sunday nights, if we went up for dinner, almost always fried chicken was on the menu. You got your fried chicken. We were usually allocated a wing or a leg.
Yes.
At the end, Aunt Ruth had a freezer, a chest freezer. This was back in the early 50s, so and that was unusual. But she and Uncle Brady had big gardens. They grew a lot of strawberries. They would freeze the strawberries. So for dessert was ice cream with strawberries. However, you could not have dessert until you got up from the table with permission, took your bone to Aunt Ruth, and had it inspected. If you had cleaned your chicken bone clean enough, she did that. Anyway, and that was Aunt Ruth. So anyway, you had to take it back. Sometimes you might have to take it back a couple of times, but we did because we wanted the strawberries.
I will add something there. When we got to be older, she came to dinner at our house one evening, and Mom had chicken. And it was time to collect the plates, and when hers came by, I said, I don't believe that this is finished. And, but that was just a joke, but it felt good.
But anyway, it was an experience with Aunt Ruth when she and Uncle Brady had no children, but they had a lot of nieces and nephews. Loudon Thompson was a nephew. Jim and Harl Thompson, Jim Thompson's 2 boys were nephews. They all still lived out in the country, so they would come in and stay with Aunt Ruth and then go to high school and go home on the weekends, and they would stay there. My dad got moved in when he was about 16 when he was moved in. But David's mother and David's grandfather, he came and stayed a lot. David's grandmother, after Uncle Brady and Uncle Duke passed away, Aunt Therese and Aunt Ruth were very close friends for a long time, many years. Anyway, the tourist home that she started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the background of how a fisher, the Fishers were from Berkeley Springs, and the Thompsons got together. Uncle Brady was born out in Three Churches at a farm out there, Cayman Orchard. I'm not sure if that was Loudon's property, if that was part of it. Did he buy? He had a place out there, but I don't know if that was the original Thompson property. But it was from Three Churches. And history becomes interesting when you find out the quirky parts. And I always keep looking for a horse thief in the family or something. It makes history a lot more interesting. It's not as boring. So the quirky part is that Aunt Ruth Fisher, she was Ruth Mabel Fisher, her father was an educator. He was a teacher and a superintendent of the school district in Morgan County. And he had been there, his family had been there for several generations. Aunt Ruth was born 1893, Uncle Brady was born 1880s. I've got the dates in, if someone wants them. I've even got the obituary here. Anyway, Uncle Brady was at Three Churches. He knew Aunt Ruth, though, at an early age, and the reason being that when Aunt Ruth was fairly young, her mother walked in. This actually made the newspapers in Berkeley Springs, but she walked in and she announced to her children that she was going to die. She went and got her Sunday clothes on, went to the bedroom, laid down on the bed, and died. I mean, back to life, and it actually made the newspapers. So anyway, what would happen at that time, at least in the family, I assume it was normal, but maybe we weren't normal now. But anyway, the children would wind up getting, when a parent would die, the children would be sent out to other relatives to help raise them. So Aunt Ruth wound up coming up on the mountain, up on Jersey Mountain, because she was related to the Johnsons. And there were Johnsons up there that she was tied in. So that's how we think she and Uncle Brady got to know each other. Now, I'm not sure whether Uncle Brady, his first endeavor was a store in Springfield, and whether they were married then or immediately thereafter. But anyway, Uncle Brady started the general feed hardware, sort of a combination southern states and hardware store, and it was a huge conglomeration. I'll get into that in a minute, but they got together. Uncle Brady went broke, and I'm not sure what broke actually meant. I don't know that it was bankrupt, but anyway, he failed. But he somehow found a way to start all over again with a store in Romney, which was down in the depot area. There was a large two-story down there. This was his second endeavor. One of the things Uncle Brady did was buy fruit crops. He would go in the spring, he would buy the crop. He took the loss if there was a hailstorm or something like that, or something that would destroy the crop. And if he didn't, of course, he sold the crop and hopefully made a profit. And apparently he was fairly successful at this, as well as having a store that sold just a huge number of items. But according to family lore, there was a change in the monetary standard in Europe, and he wound up financially, even though he made money, the money became worthless, he lost everything and went broke twice. So he came, told Aunt Ruth, he was just so depressed, he couldn't stand it. He was thinking about actually killing himself. He was that depressed. Aunt Ruth didn't say anything. She got up from the chair. They were in the living room apparently when this took place. She walked down to the basement. She came back upstairs. She threw Uncle Brady a length of rope, told him to go hang himself or get to work. She didn't have time for anything to do. And this one actually even came from Aunt Ruth. I even heard her say that. She was one tough lady. Now, when she was running this boarding house, this would have been in the 30s, pre-World War I, 40. She also provided meals. So she had the house, The houses behind Aunt Ruth's house, if you're down there, those were where the gardens were. They had a very large piece of
Huge
property.
gardens.
She also raised chickens and raised rabbits. So afternoon, she would kill the chickens, kill rabbits. She would cook. That would be dinner for the boarders or tourists, whoever was there. Breakfast the next morning. And it only cost a few dollars to get all that back there. So it was a good deal.
Plus, at the same time, she took in ironing. So she ironed during the day and gardened and canned and froze and prepared these meals. But she took in ironing, and at that time, you know, everything was starched. Plus, you ironed sheets. And those were all, you know, hand ironed sheets, and no.
Ruth was born and raised, was at Cool Font, actually just up from the spring at the main house, at the manor house. So she was transferred up. Now, my father, her brother's child, was born also in Berkeley Springs. But his mother passed away when he was about 1 and a half years old, I think, roughly. Very young.
Okay.
They wound up moving to Pennsylvania. There was a situation where brother and sister, a Fisher brother and sister, married a Rubenthal brother and sister, and part of their family got them jobs out in Brownsville, Pennsylvania. So my dad, at age 2 or something,
Right.
they moved to Pennsylvania. He
Right.
grew up there without a mother, and he was farmed out. So at 16, he was sent to Romney to live with Aunt Ruth and spent the rest of his life here.
Up until that time, he had run the streets of Brownsville and played on the slag piles. That's what he always told us anyway.
But anyway, he got here, so that's how, by having tragedy or in their early lives, that's how the Fishers wound up in Hampshire County. And anyway, Aunt Ruth married J.Brady Thompson. Dad married Nancy Harriet from town and down on the river, the
Right.
farms there, so down Fox's Hollow. Anyway, that's how we got there. You want to add to this, or?
I'm just trying to think. I will show, well, you're.
We'll get into J.Brady's store next.
Okay, all right. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. I will say that the house that Aunt Ruth had, it had a very big living room. And it was beautiful. I mean, it was beautiful. She had a huge grandfather clock in it. She had Tiffany lamps. She had tapestries on the wall, a spinning wheel, and a big fireplace with a mirror over that. And on top stood all of these very nice Staffordshire and, I forget, Mycene figurines. And then she had I think there were three corner cupboards filled with antique dishes that she had collected. And there was, Shirley was, I was talking, yeah. I was talking to his sister last night, and she remembered that there was, when you walked in the door, there was like a table, and there was always fresh flowers on that table. It was pretty nice, really, when you think about it, and you know, in retrospect. And Shirley said she remembered there were always fresh gladiola in the summertime, always. And when you went to dinner at Aunt Ruth's, you went to dinner like it was in the Victorian days. You know, there was a dish for everything. There was silverware that went this way. There were water glasses, iced tea glasses. All the china was beautiful bone china. I forget, what was the name of that? Do you remember? Springtime, wasn't it?
Maybe.
Pattern china was all done very, very well, and everybody was they were on their best behavior. White linen, you know, tablecloths and napkins that were probably washed again that evening. And she set a fine table, and it was delicious. So when guests came in there, and we would go, everybody was set up straight. You know, I can remember Mom looking at us and, sit up straight, straight.
Children were to be seen, not heard.
Not heard, and we heard that a good bit.
I always loved your dad, going into the store. His name was Manus, which I heard was Romanus.
That's correct.
Right.
What were the names of his other siblings? I'm always fascinated with first names and the family and who else had interesting names and where they came from.
Well, David's grandfather, Aunt Ruth's brother, was Brian.
Brian?
But he was not called that. He always dressed extremely well, and because he was always a coat and tie man, I think even to go hunting, he was called Duke. So he was Duke Fisher. And let's see.
Dad's name was Romanus Darlington Fisher II.
Isn't that fascinating? I
And
mean, to
they
me,
called-
that's just fascinating.
They called him Junior because, he was the junior, and he finally said, no, I'm changing his name, and he changed his name then to Manus. That's how he got the Manus.
Manus Fisher. And his father was the same name then.
He was Ross, but he wasn't Ross,
He was
it was
a junior.
granddaddy. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but
he
his
was a
father,
junior.
our
Yeah.
grandfather
Your
was
grandfather
also,
was Ross.
was Romanus. Aunt Ruth's father was Rossite, and he was the son of Shadrach. Shadrach was born in 1832 on my birthday. Can you imagine that? Almost 100 years earlier, and he still picked my birthday to be born. I thought that was amazing. But anyway, that's the Shadrach as
And he was one of,
farmer.
I think, 13, wasn't he? One of, how many brothers were there? No, not 13. Shadrach's
Shadrach
brothers.
had about
'Cause
9.
we have a picture somewhere.
Was there an Abednego?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
How do you
And then
spell
her-
the Romanus?
Romanus.
And what's that from? Where does that come from?
That's what I was wanting to know.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, we know
I'd love to
Shadrach.
say it was a fancy Roman name, but I'm sure I would be lying if I did.
Darlington, both in the same
Darlington,
name.
right. Well, we were always taught a lot, believe me. I should tell some of those stories, but somehow we were, what were we? We were Dutch? Fisher
German.
was- Oh, German, well, Rubenthal was German.
And also
And-
Fisher.
Oh, okay, so Fisher was German, so it must have been some kind of a German, maybe a German name. She was,
The Fisher, there are a lot of Fisher names. Fishers are a dime a dozen in the country. Even if you go back and do genealogy research, I had a friend of mine who did some tracking, and according to what he found, that the first Fisher was a Hessian soldier that came over to South Carolina. And he didn't, of course, want us to be a Hessian mercenary, so he found a way to skip out and headed up this way and made it up into Morgan County and was a deserter from the Hessian army, but actually wound up purchasing a few tracts of land in Morgan County, or what is now Morgan County, and that got the
They were
start.
actually given land if they were Hessian soldiers.
Yeah, there were a lot of Germans in Morgan County, and then the Rubenthals came over. This was in the late 1700s. My paternal grandmother, that was a Rubenthal, they came to Morgan County in the early 1800s, and they were, the first ones were masons. There's a lot of stonework still in Berkeley Springs. It was done by our great-great-grandfather. Anyway, that's...
well, and then I think Aunt Ruth, she went back her great-grandmother was a Van Arsdale or something.
Maternal, yes, there were Van Arsdales, Johnsons,
Johnson.
these are a lot of Morgan County names that are still,
And her
some of
name
them are
was-
still very prevalent.
Mabel Ruth, and then my father was the baby. He was the 5th. There were 4 sisters. Aunt Pauline, Aunt Edna Pearl was her name, but we called her Aunt Ed. Helen, and Viola, and then Dad. And where he got Romanus.
Well, he got it from his father, was also.
Well, yeah, but
Where that came from.
but where that came from is hard to tell.
Yeah, they're a little different.
Yeah.
But Ross I was an educator, so Ross I probably picked it out of something he read.
Right.
Aunt Ruth actually had a certificate to teach school and did that for a few years, either before she married Uncle Brady or right after, but not very
Right.
long.
Well, she told me they used to court in a buckboard. They'd come together and they'd go to church and all that. So that, and then she was, because she was an educator, she knew, oh my goodness, she could recite all kinds of stuff. And that's how she entertained her guests. In the evening, you went into the living room and you sat down. The children were given Lincoln Logs. You might be given the National Geographics, which JC and I loved. Or you could play Parcheesi. I think she had a Parcheesi. No.
Oh, the
big-
marble, yeah.
Oh, and the marble, the thing, and the smart, the IQ game, she would pass that around. And then these people, they sat around and told stories, and something would, trigger something, and she would go off on this poem. She would recite an entire poem, and she was very dramatic. So you got all the nuance.
Oh, how many times did we hear about Hiawatha? On the shores of Gitchiguma, name the hero.
Well, I will tell these stories because they are. She was really a bird, but she and her sister, who lived in Bridgewater, Agatha, she would come to visit, and when those two got together and we went to visit, then the big story was that Sitting Bull was our great grandfather. Well, we were all little kids and we just ate that up on, so one summer we went to Atlantic City for a vacation and went to Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. There, one of these dioramas was a model of Sitting Bull sitting by a campfire. And my youngest brother got very, very somber, and he said, "Look, Mother, there's Grandpa." And with that, my mother, shoot us into the next apartment because people were doubting. So, but yeah, she told us that, and they also said that Johnny Appleseed was a frequent guest, and that Agatha would sit on his lap and he would tell them stories about his, and then Shirley, just recently, she called me, they're doing Ancestry.com, and she called me, she said, "I just want you to know," she was very unhappy, she said, "I don't have a bit of Native American blood." She was really disappointed. That was because we had all just, oh boy, did that fill us with all kinds of imaginable, games and stuff.
We were teenagers before we found out these stories weren't true. We were from there.
Right.
Our whole ancestry just went up the smoke.
Yes, we didn't.
Well, I was the same way. Dad had a scar on his back, and it's where he got shot with an arrow. I was probably 45 by the time. They love to tell those stories.
But anyway, J.Brady Thompson's third and successful store was right across the street where Sheets is. It was a
And I do have a picture
very
of that.
ugly wooden building. It was actually divided up, but on this side, facing this way, was a store in front. That was Tiny Serball's Army-Navy store. So the Uncle Brady, he had the second floor and about 3/4 of the back. The Tiny Serball had an Army-Navy surplus store right here. Potomac Edison was next door with when they had appliances. And then there was Libby's Hot Dogs when we were young, very small, and it was an extra special time. We didn't go home for lunch. Dad would take us to Libby's for one of her hot dogs. That was living life at the max. You just didn't get any better than Libby's Hot Dogs. If anybody ever has her recipe, I would give anything to have that. But Uncle Brady did just about everything. I tried to make a list of what he had. Of course, he's orchard spray, fertilizer, lime. We would take a truck, go down to Tom's Brook, to the lime quarry down there, and load up, bring truckloads of lime back. Livestock feed. And I can remember ladies coming into the store, their husband would buy sacks of horse feed, whatever. Anyway, they would go back and pick the sacks that they wanted to use, because the sacks they would, after they took the feed out, then they would take the sack apart and either make clothing, or they would make, in this case, I think it's either bread spread or tablecloth, I'm not sure. My wife collects some of these things, so she loaned me a couple of these to bring tonight, but
Flour sack.
those are flour sacks. And
That looks
and
like
then
a duster.
a friend of my wife's is a quilter, and she just, probably about 10 years ago or something, made a pillow out of some scraps that my wife had. I guess the moths had gotten it too bad, but she was able to do that. But that would be typical. And ladies would go back and they would pick out which sacks they wanted to have delivered.
I remember my mother picking out which sack, either there at J.Brady's or down at the feed mill in Homer R.
Right.
Yeah.
When did they
Make
have time to do
dresses,
that
too.
kind of stuff?
Oh, yeah, dresses were made out of it.
They made dresses,
Dresses
everything.
and everything.
I don't know, well, they didn't have TV. They didn't, TV didn't come in, radio, I don't believe radio was a big deal to these women. We never, radio didn't come in until maybe the early 60s, maybe, we started listening.
John Charles, when you brought the lime and stuff up, did you go around behind it, the store, or where did you unload it?
We would back the trucks, or not we, I just rode along, but we would back right up in the street, and then the truck would be sticking out.
There was a porch like a loading dock.
Yep, there was loading dock up there along the side, and then another in the back.
There was that does not show the porch. There was a porch along the side, and there were big doors that opened up, like,
Right.
and then you could walk
Trucks would
out.
be sitting out in the street backed up. Okay.
Yeah, we
It
would
was
be
a
sitting
little
out in the street.
recess from the,
When you said, go on, John.
What is the name on this sign?
that might be Bergdahl, is that Bergdahl?
Bergdahl, thank you.
Mhm.
So that
Wait a
thing-
minute, Dot gave me this, the racket store, Abraham Bergdahl store, Keadle store, J.Brady Thompson store, was at the side of A.E. Bergdahl store. It had a ramp where you could back up and load feed, etc. And the whole complex was known as Ginkerson's Corner. Gilkerson's Corner? Yeah, Gilkerson, I'm sorry, Gilkerson's Corner. He was a banker, and he may have rented the stores to all of those fellas that had places
So
along there.
I'm just, geographically, I'm confused. So the ramp was actually on Grafton Street?
Yes, the building
Okay.
was long, it wasn't
And Brady-
very wide, but it went way back.
And the hot dog place was up that way too?
Yes,
Okay.
The hot dog place
or the,
was,
oh no, the hot dog place was right here where
On Main
they used to sell the
Oh,
music.
oh, it was then, Charlie. Yeah.
Inside, there was a ramp.
So this is Main Street, this is Grafton
You see
Street.
the,
and inside, right
Inside,
inside,
there was
yes,
a ramp.
Yes.
I can remember running up and down that ramp.
yes.
Okay.
You remember that?
So what
don't you?
year is this?
But they sold
I'm
paint, numerous different brands of paint. Now, Uncle Brady sold fencing, and when he went broke the second time, he owed a lot of money to U.S. Steel for fence. And the way that he managed to recover and get back into business was he wrote a letter to the president, chairman of U.S. Steel, apologized, said he owed them money. He knew that. He had fallen on bad times. He couldn't pay the bill now, but he wanted to assure them that he would work and eventually he would pay them back. My dad had the letter. I think our brother Bob still has it.
Oh, really?
But he got a letter back from the chair of U.S. Steel. He said, "Dear Mr. Brady, or dear Mr. Thompson, you've been a valued customer of ours for many, many years. We are sorry to hear about your unfortunate situation. Please be advised that today we have sent 3 railroad cars of fencing to Romney to get you started. We hope you can pay us back as soon as possible, but this will help get you going. And thank you for being a great customer. And Dad had that letter that he kept up in the store. But that was typical of what Uncle Brady would do and get away with. You couldn't do that today, but at that time that was common. But he also passed that on to his customers. I can remember, I spent a lot of time at the store. Nellie Michael was his secretary before she went to work when Dad started his place, but Nellie would be there. And they had an office in the middle of that building. And people, it didn't matter who you were. I mean, you could be the poorest person in Hampshire County or the richest person, and Uncle Brady treated everybody pretty much the same. But a lot of the farmers and orchardists paid their bill once a year. And they would come in January and sit down, and they would have shoe boxes or cigar boxes of receipts. And they would sit there and they would say, well, this receipt is for such and such a farm or such, and they would divide all these up sitting at this double desk with Uncle Brady, and then they would pay the bill once a year. So now, I mean, you think a farmer buying feed, fertilizer, seed in the spring and spray all summer and didn't harvest, and it'd be the end of the year or January before they would come in and pay a year's worth, but then you went another year before you got paid again. And he extended credit to everybody like that. It was an amazing
Story
time.
about J.Brady. My father grew up enough about going where he never darkened the door. The Methodist Church needed a rug for something in the church. And Mr. Brady Thompson said, we'll get that rug. Says, Dan Williams is going to give it. And he put it on his bill. He gave the rug to the Methodist Church. Dad paid for it through his bill.
That would be Aunt
Well, it was
Ruth.
very typical. I mean,
That was the way things
everybody
were.
was, yeah, and I think when my father gave money to the church, it came through J.Brady.
But Uncle Brady and Aunt Ruth were very prominent in the Methodist Church. Aunt Ruth taught adult Sunday school for over 30 years.
But he tithes for him. It was in his bill at the end of the year.
He made sure everybody taught. But as a kid, I would go up there. I mean, that store was a playground for me. And it was multiple rooms, 2 floors. You would go upstairs, there was one room, and this was in the 1950s, but there was still a room, probably this size, of nothing but horse harness, even in the 1950s. I don't think he hardly sold anything then, but there was a room of it. I mean, it was huge. There was rooms that would have plow points and feed and fertilizer. He also bought black walnuts in the fall. People would bring them in, he would buy them, resell them. He bought and sold chickens in the store, eggs. The eggs, when the state school had the Easter egg hunt, at Easter, that J.Brady was the one that furnished all the eggs for that they would cook and hard boil. But he had, I mean, the eggs, just everything.
They had live chickens too.
Oh yeah, live chickens.
I can remember my mother set me up for one in the late 20s. And our neighbor worked up there. He took the chicken out in the backyard, or out the back door there, chopped his head off, put it in a bag, and I brought it home.
That's how you did it.
It was just that way it was everything.
Fresh trash.
Yes.
No peanut.
Uncle Brady sold garden seed as well. He bought seed from Myers Seed Company in Baltimore. They shipped them up here. My dad, when he had the store, he also dealt with Myers. As far as I know, they are still in business.
The co-op dealt with my seed.
But Aunt Ruth liked to travel. She purchased a lot of antiques. And they would just, Uncle Brady, she would say, Brady, we're going on, we need to get away. They would drive to Mexico and drive through Mexico, down to Monterrey, Mexico City, drive back. They would go to Canada, they would go to Niagara Falls. They were in Baltimore visiting his grandfather and grandmother, and apparently somehow they found out about a cruise going out of Baltimore to New England. But Uncle Brady, I guess he didn't have enough cash to pay the bill or whatever, everything else. He said, well, I really want to go, Brady. And she said, can't you do something? And Brady said, well, yes, I can. So they drove down to the Myers Seed Company. Uncle Brady walked in, introduced himself, said, my wife wants to go on a cruise. I need some money. Can you help me out? They said, no problem, Mr. Thompson. We'll get the tickets. You be on the ship. And they went for a 2-week cruise, came back at Myers Seed Company expense. When Uncle Brady got back, I'm sure he sent him a check, but nevertheless, that was how business was done. It just, it's mind-boggling.
Are you going to tell about when he went to the bank to borrow the money?
Well, this must have been around early 40s, late 30s. Uncle Brady, I guess that they had reached the point when they had gone beyond being broke all the time. They had finally got some money. And Uncle Brady had paid all of his debts off. He didn't owe anybody anything. And he told my dad, he said, I cannot sleep. He said, I have not been able to sleep at night. He said, I'm exhausted. He said, I'm going to the bank and borrow some money. So he went to the Bank of Romney. Now, Uncle Brady died in 1958. Dad and Aunt Ruth went to the bank to get to the safe deposit box. A lot of people in Romney had lost a lot of money over in the Depression and all, and afterwards buying stock. So a lot of people, instead of buying stock, they bought bonds, and they would have stacks of bonds in the safety deposit box. So Dad and Aunt Ruth went in, got the safety deposit box, took out the safety deposit box. Dad went in, picked up $15,000 in cold hard cash, walked to the teller and paid the note off in 1958, and whatever interest would have been owed. Interest was pretty small. But Uncle Brady had borrowed $15,000, put it in cash in the safety deposit box, and had left it there for years. And I guess yearly paid the interest or whatever it was, but he was able to sleep well at night.
Because he owed money.
Yeah, he owed money, things were back to normal. Yeah. But they sold glass, they sold galvanized pipe, they had a pipe cutting machine, and it stayed out on the street. They didn't even put this was a big electric, at that time, very expensive machine, and they would keep the galvanized pipe. It was not locked up.
They cut threads on them.
They put the threads, would cut it off. It went, when J.Brady closed, Dad put it in his store. He used it until they went out of business. And the same machine, it was a rigid pipe machine. When I was a kid, one of my jobs was to cut scrap pipe up to make nipples and so forth and fittings for them. Tools, hose. He also bought honey. If you wanted honey, you go to J.Brady Thompson's. He had gallons and gallons of honey. Country ham, bacon. He had a room that had a screen on it, and that was to keep the rats, I guess, out of the hams and ham them up. And you would buy hams as well. I mean, chicken, eggs, hams, bacon, honey, all this. Black walnuts, all this stuff. I'm surprised he did much with black walnuts. If you've ever tried black walnuts, you know they have a strong taste to them. I have been addicted since a little kid because I stole more black walnuts and ate them while being up there at the store. That was my snack, so I got used to the taste, and I still like black walnuts to this day.
John Charles, maybe I missed it, but what was the years of the store in operation?
The store, Uncle Brady died in 1958. His inventory was so large that that store continued to run without any resupply for 1 year. At the end of that year, the Whip brothers came in and had an auction with what was left. It took them 2 whole Saturdays from early morning till dark to sell everything that was left in that store. And that's what Dad didn't move down to his new store, because he moved into the Millicent building down here.
Which is Alan Riley's.
Right, I remember.
And,
And what year did it start?
Well, it would have started, would have to go back to Springfield, then he went out, then he went down to the depot. Now, he still owned the building at the depot and used that also as a warehouse. And then when he died, Dad didn't use the depot very much, and he wound up leasing it to Homer Feller. And Homer used it to store some of his orchard equipment, and then it burned down, and there was a big fire when it
I remember
burned to
that.
the
Do you remember
ground.
that?
That was,
Well, I remember the big fire, well, it was on Sunday after church.
You
We
remember
went
that?
after church on our bicycles down to watch.
watch it burn.
Yeah, sat up on the hill.
And what burned?
The depot,
The warehouse.
Railroad depot.
yeah, railroad depot and half the other part of the town down there.
Is that all? Because there were a number of buildings down there, weren't there?
Yes, there were, yeah.
Didn't
There was
Mr. Brady own that big 2-story house though? That was maybe
Billy
Well, you'd be down by,
down by the depot. His was
No.
on the other side.
no, well, that was on the other side. There was the Uncle Brady, and then there was the railroad station, and then the house is up on the hill.
Okay, I was thinking this.
But Uncle Brady, now Aunt Ruth and Uncle Brady, they owned the lot that we just sold across the street in Romney. If you go, Heatwell's lived in a house down there, but there was a house where that storage buildings are down there. That was also a house Aunt Ruth owned and rented. Had a couple other houses in town that they rented. And then down here, there was where there was the not laundromat, but dry cleaner laundromat.
There's a laundromat.
Yeah, well, next to that, on the other side of that was a small lot, and that was the pipe yard for Uncle Brady. And they had clay pipe in the 50s, that's when you put a sewer line in, or wasn't plastic pipe then, you put clay pipe, and the town, he and Dave Shear were buddies, and the town bought a lot of the sewer lines and so forth, material from him, so that was all stocked down here in the pipe yard. So that was another part of the store. There wasn't nobody was down there, but that's where
Where
they
the
stored
Daily
everything.
House is?
Yeah, it was just on the other side of where the laundromat was.
Between the laundromat and the Daily House.
Yeah, oh, between there.
Between there, small, it wasn't a big lot.
You know, the stables were the laundromat, and then there was a little space there, and I guess
Yeah, okay.
that's.
The stables were the laundromat.
Well, there was the stables to the
Keller Hotel.
Keller Hotel,
We're
and
back
they
in
turned that into a laundromat during the 60s. I think.
I thought the
60s.
laundromat
was Schuler's service
It was.
station.
What's
So the
that?
stables
The
were brick?
laundromat was where Schuler's service station was.
Oh.
Where the stables used to be.
Where the stables used.
So it's this back parking lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
What, Jane, what did you say?
Schuler's had the service station, and then the laundromat was put in it. Andy
Oh, okay.
Schuler's?
Andy Schuler, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't, he was a good woodworker.
Right.
Mom had stuff.
Well, it was Andy's father that had the,
Oh, the service station, and then Andy. Oh, well, that, my mom just always, I'm going by, mom's called it the stable. I don't know
well, there
why.
was a stable right there behind the hotels. But
Well,
then that concrete building was a service station or garage, and
Okay.
it was Schuler's.
Oh, all right, all right. Well, close. Close, but nice. Not one for me. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't, your voice is going.
My voice is gonna go. These
I'm
people
trying to
get
think
way
what
too
else there is to say about the, I don't remember, I used to go to Uncle Brady's store when we were little,
And I remember going up the steps into the door, and then you'd walk, and there was a big glass window. And that's where Brady and Nellie sat. So, and then you would turn the corner, and you'd go up the ramp into the big room. And then there was a door that went off to the left and would go down a hallway into the office proper if you had business that you had to do in the office. And Mother would make me go, of course, into the office. I wasn't allowed in any part of the store. I had to stay with Nellie. So Nellie would give me a piece of paper and a pencil, and she'd say, "You draw." And so that's what I would do. And at the time when I was little, my hair was even finer, and it was very blow away. So Dad would always call me Gravel Gertie. "What are you doing, Gravel Gertie?" So that was what I remembered about the store proper. And then there was a salesman who used to come to the store, and he would go stay at Aunt Ruth's. And his name was Mr. Sylvie. Do you remember? And he was real good to us kids for some reason. And when we would lose a tooth, we would get a silver dollar from Mr. Sylvie. And we all collected from the teeth we lost. That made losing teeth very palatable. We didn't mind that because we'd get a silver dollar from Mr. Sylvie. And they were all Morgan dollars. I guess we all got. Did we all get silver dollars
I got
back
silver
then?
dollars for my birthday, I still got them all.
Oh, so, yeah.
Yeah, they're in the safety deposit box at the bank.
Wow, well, that's pretty good.
I only
I'm
had
looking at this.
J.Brady also bought and sold the wool market from all the farmers in the area. In the spring, he would have burlap bags that were real long. They were 12, 15, 16 feet long, that big around, stuffed with wool. And he would put them back in the warehouse, and there was a trap door, a big trap door, probably 6 feet by 6 feet over top this. So when I would, after school, I would be sent up and play, and I was a challenging child growing up, because I would jump out of the second floor down into these bales of wool. But they had, of course, a lot of, I smelled terrible. But I had a great time, but my parents had a rough time.
I'm trying to think of more information about, now this is some of the memorabilia that Dot brought in. This is a box that she got at a sale here, and it's signed on here with J.Brady's signature, so that's pretty neat to see. And then this is a Fisher's Hardware level that says "always on the level." So that was something else that Dot brought in. I will say that Uncle Braid had J.Brady's, and my dad had Fisher's Hardware. And then when I married Fred and he became the manager at the co-op, I really felt I had cornered the market. I will say that. That really made me feel like I knew hardware. I knew nothing about hardware, but I could talk with these about hardware. I'm trying to think if there's other
Romney
things.
was a booming place back in the 30s. I mean, Dad would, before my time, but Dad would talk about coming into town on Saturday. They sometimes didn't close until 11 o'clock at night, and the streets would be packed with people. I mean, there was business from one end of town on 50 to the other, plus side streets, and I mean, people came in from the country, and that was a
Winchester had.
Oh, well, that's, you know what, I don't doubt that, because even when I was growing up in the when I was conscious of being around, but that would be the late 50s, early 60s, I guess, and it was a booming place. The movie theater, the drugstores, you went up and you got dressed up to go to town, you got even more dressed up to go to Cumberland and Winchester. That was a big deal. And so there was a lot going on in town,
Why did you go to Winchester?
usually to the doctor.
Yeah.
It was a little bit, a little bigger place in the doctor.
Not shopping.
You went-
Well, no, we
Cumberland
went
to get
shopping, but not that often. Cumberland, we went shopping to more than
If
Winchester.
Mama thought the prices at Rosenbaum's had gone up too much, she went to Lake
Schwartz and
Winchester.
Bosch.
Yeah, she could take her business elsewhere.
You go to Schwartz and Bosch for your Boy Scout stuff.
Right.
My mom went to Rosenbaum's, and you got to go, if you were really good, you got to go upstairs to the lunch counter.
Yes,
The
yes.
elevator. Yeah, that
There
was a
were
big deal.
biscuits for lunch.
Yeah, well, yeah, Woolworths for the lunch counter up at the end of the street.
Right.
Big deal.
Street 10-cent stores over there.
Yeah.
Well, and I always enjoyed going up to Hershey, the cab company, Hershey's counter.
Up here on High Street.
Yeah, where, I guess where the Italian Touch was that?
Yeah, Mario's there.
And, yeah, they had a counter and we went up there after school when we were very young and looking for quarters. We would do that. Yeah, Romney was all for that. Now, does anybody have any, I'm trying to think of other things. She had quilts and she had Mariner's Compass and Old Tea Rose. The upstairs of the tourist home had 4 bedrooms, and the first one was on the right, and it had a sink in it, a working sink, and that was, top dollar. Yeah. Or we thought it was really cool, And then from there you could go up into the attic, which was where we would sneak. And then there was another bedroom at the end, I think that had 2 beds in it. The first bedroom had 2 beds, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And the next bedroom had 2 bedrooms. Do you remember?
We only stayed in that front bedroom, which had the 2
okay.
2 beds.
Mm-hmm.
Well, but the front and left bedrooms had 2 beds. Then the back on the right had a double and a single. And then the one on the left was where Aunt Teresa stayed a lot, had the brass bed. I've still got the brass bed.
And then the bathroom upstairs was this large affair with frosted windows and black and white tile. I mean, it was all tiled and slick and spotless. I remember all of that. I just remembered something and it went. I'm sorry, I couldn't remember that. What else about people that came to, we got to know a lot of them, besides Mr. Sylvie. Mrs. Phillips came to visit.
She's from Billington.
And they would come for the foliage, is what they would do. And then, of course, that was in conjunction with the hotel, who also had Mrs. Roosevelt would come there. And what was her name? J.Brady, who was the cook at the New Century?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Well, who was the cook at the New Century? Do you remember Mrs.?
Well, they had a number.
Nancy Bowman said her mother cooked
Her
there,
mother-
Mrs. Prescray.
Her mother
Mrs.
was there,
Prescott.
and I know she was a wonderful pastry
Uh-huh.
cook.
Well, I know they served family style, and of course, Aunt Ruth served family style. You sat at a big table is what you sat at.
Yeah.
And
Clara Seipel.
Seipel, that's the one
Yeah,
Mom knew.
She ran it, and I think at that time, maybe her first cousins maybe had bought it or leased it or something, because she was a widow, and she came here and ran that hotel.
I
And they said
see.
it was really first class, I've always understood.
Right, right. And Mrs. Roosevelt stopped here on the way to Arthurdale. She would stop for lunch and then go on to Arthurdale. And most of the, a lot of the tourists would come for the fall foliage, and then following the fall foliage tourists were the deer hunters. And at that time we had the Pioneer and the Carlton and probably all the other places. But what I remember the most were
Green Palm.
the Green Palm, right,
Green Palm.
were all the
Street.
cars.
Across the street was Marinitsits.
I don't
They were
remember.
Greek.
Yes. Then he the one that started the pool hall eventually?
And then down on, what was his name? I can't think of his name. He had a little hamburger, hot dog place. Right there was a Reagan. Hotel Calregan,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's right.
So there were a lot of places to eat in Romney.
Yes, and then, Charlie,
Was there a Snibby's tourist home?
Snibby's?
Yeah, that was Mary Pugh's family.
I have a picture of it.
Yeah,
Where
it's
was
on
this
the
Snibby's?
website, and I
I
don't have no
remember
idea
that.
where it was.
The building's still there, Snibby Home's still there.
Which one is
Is
that?
that-
It's the, right down inside the White Egg. I mean, the 7-Eleven.
7-Eleven. Was that the
the
brick?
old Rosemont,
That's.
the law office now.
Snibby Home.
That's right, that's
Oh,
right.
Sherman's Law Office?
Yeah, where the law office is.
I remembered it as the aquarium.
Oh, right, that was
Dr. Mike
the,
had a huge
well, that,
aquarium.
I remember that place as the Fleek House. That was Betty
Yeah,
Fleek.
that's where Johnny Bell.
Johnny Fleek lived there. That was the Fleek House to me. And then, beside of that was the brick house. Wasn't there an old Victorian brick house with a wrought iron fence around the front of it? It was
Where
beautiful.
the gas station is?
Yes,
Or 7-Eleven, it's right on that corner.
right.
That was where
It
Ma
was
Dolan
beautiful.
lived.
Ma Dolan lived there
Where
and,
7-Eleven was.
It was a couple.
Yeah,
Connie.
there was a duplex there.
yeah. But I remember that as being
Remember Gene
beautiful.
Cooper lived there, Miss Cooper.
Oh,
Remember Gene Cooper?
uh-huh. Well, the other thing that I remember, of course, the hunters would come to Aunt Ruth's and of course, the other places in town, but what I remember the most about the hunters coming were all the cars parked along Main Street with the deer strapped onto the fenders. And that, I don't remember if we had buck and doe season back then, or you just
Usually buck for
buck, we were.
buck only.
And I don't think there were that many buck down on 28, were there? I don't remember. One time there was a big kill, because your dad was involved in that, and they had all the bucks hanging up on those, like a gauntlet kind of, or garrison, or whatever. What do they call that when you strangle something? They had them all, strung up there.
You were talking about Saturday night in the cars. On Main Street, they didn't parallel park. They pulled in at an angle on one side, and I don't know, I think they parked parallel on the other side. So it was pretty tight driving through Romney.
Uh-huh. Now that, I would just remember them one in front of the other, and especially in front of the Pioneer. And the Pioneer, of course, had wonderful food, and that's where everybody went on Sundays after church for dinner. Or Aunt Ruth and her buddies, they held court there for I don't know how long.
French fries and gravy.
French fries and gravy, and homemade rolls, and those old ladies would stuff those rolls in their pocketbooks and carry them home for
That
dinner.
was dinner Sunday night, the roll was dinner. The roll in the pocketbook, every pocketbook went out of there with a roll in it.
You usually got 2 to a plate, I believe. And then, if I can't remember anything more about the tourist home.
What year
That we had-
was the tourist home built?
They built that
I would
place.
say late 20s, early 30s would be my guess. It was, but as Nancy Ann said, the living room covered the entire front of the house. It went from one side to the other, and there was dental mold and crown mold all the way around the ceiling, and she had this palace oriental rug that went across,
Went the whole length of the room, and then had runners
that went
into the
upstairs.
kitchen and up the stairs. So
When did he put the store in up here in town? You said he was down at the depot first.
do you know when that happened?
Probably around 1940, late 30s, early 40s.
I don't know, that picture that's going around, that looks, I don't I was what?
Dad
1940s?
Dad would have gotten here about 1939, and Uncle Brady was up here. Dad worked for Orville Umstadt when he was in high school. When he went, in the morning, Aunt Ruth would make him go out that big yard beside the house, that's still a big yard now. Aunt Ruth would send Dad out before school with an eyedropper and a little jar of gasoline. And he would have to put a drop of gasoline on each
Dandelion.
dandelion coming up.
He
Then
didn't,
he'd go to school and come back and go to Orville's and clerk at Orville's until he closed that night.
he didn't appreciate that very much. He didn't, Aunt Ruth wasn't very popular with him. But now there was another story, you probably know this one. There was wrestling or boxing in Cumberland.
Yeah.
And Dad wanted to go, and Uncle Brady was going to take Dad. And he got the flu or a cold and had a fever. And Aunt Ruth said, absolutely not. They were not going to ride to Cumberland and make that child sicker. So,
The best one is Jane Wright's mother in Magdalen. One of them had a birthday party at your house. And your mother, Dad had to be in at 8 o'clock. Well, they hadn't even cut the cake yet, and your mother called Aunt Ruth to ask her for permission for Dad to stay so they could at least cut the cake.
no.
Oh,
So, yeah.
your mother tried to do that.
She was pretty tough. She was pretty tough. But so Uncle Braid got Dad to put ice cubes in his mouth. And then they put the thermometer in his mouth. And they went to Aunt Ruth and he said, look, Mabel, he called her Mabel, look, Mabel, this boy's fever's broke. And I'm sure Aunt Ruth must have known. She couldn't have been that, but they went to the fight that night in Cumberland. Yeah. I remember that story. And I'm trying to think of other ones, but I don't.
Yes.
I can't. Oh,
In terms of, as you keep mentioning this, I've got to bring up, and I don't remember the end of this story, but in terms of the rigidity and the frugality of Aunt Ruth, I know that we would come down,
Actually,
down outside of Baltimore, and
yeah.
because Aunt Ruth and my grandmother, Teresa Fisher, Brian Fisher, they were very close. And so through time and through whatever happened anyway, my dad bought property down on Buffalo Hollow Road, and there was a small cabin there. So they would frequently come down on the weekends, and of course, I don't know how much of the Fishers know about this, but there were many a debate as to my dad say, I've got to go to the cabin, I've got to do this, I got to do this and work on this. And my mom, well, you know you're going to Aunt Ruth's house anyway. So we would all generally go to Aunt Ruth's to visit for a period of time. And on one occasion, we were there for dinner. And you didn't waste food. Now, I was young.
you were
5, maybe 4, 6, something like that. And everybody had finished eating, and whether I wasn't hungry or whether I was full or whatever, I wasn't. Well, everybody got up and left the table and went in the living room to spend time and talk, and I was left at the table because I wasn't getting up until the food on my plate was gone. Well, as I said, I can't tell you the end of the story. I don't know who picked me up, but they picked my face up out of the plate, carried me out to the car, and we went. I don't know whether the eggs were ever eaten, but I didn't. But I remember that if you had food on your plate, you didn't waste it, and I learned that lesson young. But it was, I always enjoyed stopping at Aunt Ruth's house. She describes it to me, it was like a museum. I mean, it was just beautiful, and the one chair in the living room,
I forgot telling
that
about that.
was hand carved with monkeys and vines, and it wasn't relief, it was
It was, we called it the monkey bench because it was the size of a bench.
Yeah, it was like a
With a big back.
two-seater.
The wood was that thick and.
There were monkeys all over it and vines.
Yeah, and she's right, as a kid, you were to be seen and not heard if you had to be seen. Then I spent time out in the garden, so I wasn't seen. But I could spend a good bit of time just sitting on that chair and looking at the carving and relief of that chair. It was absolutely beautiful. There are so many things to see when you went there. It was a phenomenal place to stay, and I really enjoyed it.
It was
As tough as that lady was, and as much as she made everybody toe the line, and everybody still loved her.
Oh, she was, yeah.
You just, that was the big thing, to go to Aunt Ruth. Even though you knew you were gonna get yelled at as soon as you walked in.
right there.
In my family, my father was certainly the head of the household and the ruler of the
Yes, he
castle.
was.
Until he went to Aunt Ruth. Aunt Ruth, she took leadership, here you go. But she was a prize to know and love.
Yes, she was.
I remember one of the antiques, and I'm not sure if it was that bench, but I remember Aunt Ruth telling the story that she had something like that. One of the antiques was in the attic, and she watched the governor, the governor's house, or some big person's house, and she saw this antique in his house, and she said, well, if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me, and she went up to the attic and brought it down and kept it in the living room. But I don't remember which antique.
Well, she also had sort of an imagination. I mean, if we were the result of, Sitting Bull, Johnny Appleseed, heaven knows who others, there was a lot of, and that was so with her antiques. And the desk that she used in the living room was supposedly from the castle in Berkeley Springs. And the monkey bench was supposedly, thousands, hundreds of years old, I'm only exaggerating, hundreds of years old. So she sent a picture of it to the Smithsonian with the offer of donating it to them. And they sent a reply that said, thank you very much, but there were hundreds of them all over the country that they were very well-known reproductions. But for us kids, they filled our imaginations. And she did have beautiful stuff. She really did, and a lot of them were very, very nice. And but the monkey bench, I'm sorry to say, was not. I think the invite took that. Yeah.
I thought it was.
Yeah.
Nancy and J.C., can you tell me what happened in 1959? I mean, if the Army Navy store was there and Libby's, what happened to the building? Did it stay there and change?
When did Potomac Edison?
Potomac Edison bought it, tore it down, and then that was it. And then it went through several owners after Potomac Edison until Sheets finally.
Now,
They tore it down and put trucks back in there, didn't they? Yeah.
You could have.
I don't remember it that well, but I remember signing up for my election at Potomac Edison. And I thought that was an older building. I mean, it didn't look to me as though it's something that they had built for that purpose. It looked like it was left over from something.
Potomac Edison had two sites. They had the original building, which was between Uncle Braid's and the Legion, and then they put in a bigger yard, and their trucks and so forth were here. But they didn't stay there very. I mean, it was a short period of time, maybe a year or two, was all Potomac Edison had the big lot. But the original building was torn down after he got out.
But your father opened Fisher's Hardware on the south side of Route 50. Which building is it?
Alan Riley's, where his law office is. That
Okay,
was
same big windows. and
yes. And I'm just trying. And it was Paul Millicent's dry goods grocery store.
Yep.
Was that?
That's right.
Paul Millicent had it before Dad, then Dad had it, and then one of our other brothers, Bob, took it over after Dad, and then
he sold it, I guess, to Alan Riley, and Alan Riley had it as a law office. That's sort of what went on there. I'm trying to think of any other.
Do you remember anything about Fisher's? I mean, you've got all these memories about J.Brady Thompson's, but Fisher's Hardware
Dad's
is a
store.
smaller version of that? Or
Dad's,
Much smaller, much
Yeah.
smaller. Dad never was big enough to survive. He did, times changed, Walmarts and things like that came in, and Dad was too little, too late. It just never took off then.
I remember if you went in the back, in the back of the store part, then there was like a walled little office area with a couple desks.
yeah, there were,
There.
yeah, Nellie moved up there, Nellie was
Yeah.
there, and Dad was there, and then there was a chair for anybody who wanted to come in and
and
spend
sit
the
and talk.
afternoon.
Yeah. And then in the back was where I think some of the old equipment
Yes.
from Brady Thompson's came over. Because I didn't get to go in the back very often, but when I went back there, it was like, whoa, look at all this cool stuff.
Yeah, that was where they cut glass and did the pipe and
Yeah.
stored the paint and mixed the paint there
Yeah.
at one point
Right.
when Bob had, but yeah, they had a lot of, there was a lot of conventions held in that little office. I do remember that, and there was, at one point, it was before Bob took it over, that was a meeting place for lunch at, for the young lawyers in town. Well, I think Donnie was judge at the time.
The prosecutor, probably.
No, judge, he
Your
was
dad
judge.
spent a lot of time there.
I know.
A
I have a
judge.
story about your dad
Oh,
in the
dear.
hardware store. This is, I don't remember if your dad told the story or my dad told the story, but George Arnold went in one day. And
That's
he
enough right there.
said, Manus, how much would it cost if I bought a dozen gallons of paint? And Manus said, well, let me figure it up, what it would be per gallon. And he figured up an amount, and Mr. Arnold said, okay, I'll take 1 gallon. Thank you. And never came back on the counter allowed.
That was sort of the way,
Yeah.
That was a great way of saying there must be a
a better way.
cheaper by the dozen
Yeah.
price,
Yeah, I
and so
know.
I'm going to get you to settle on that one, and then I'll take one.
We always called him second gear Arnold, because he used to drive his car around town in second gear. We used to pass him on our bicycle.
Oh, he was
He
on
shaved
point.
And if we had a few
This has been good. Isn't it nice? The flavor of what life used to be is just fascinating.
Well, I think that, but it also indicates, and this is all the tourist homes had characters in them. And Romney was full of characters, of nothing else. There were characters, and there was always, somebody always did something. At yours tourist home, Dad would go there for, between churches. And he walked in on Aunt Susan one day, and she was icing her cake like this. And he never got over that. He loved that story. He said, I saw Susan icing her cake with her fingers.
With her fingers.
Yeah.
Let's fluff up that.
Yes, make those little curls on top. That's all. And there was tons of stories about her, and then her sons, of course, Robert and Randolph and Arthur. And just an indication, I will tell this story, it's a little off color, but Arthur, at one point, somebody asked him about his brothers, and he said, well, I'll just tell you. He said, Randolph's money crazy, and Robert's sex crazy, and I'm plain crazy. That's how he, and they pretty much were, weren't they? Yeah, I remember them, but they were pretty funny.